Hey everyone, this is Luke Johnson. I'm back with Dr. Jonathan Cook to do a quick update of our last session on Hawthorne's The Marble Faun. Dr. Cook, I believe, had about three minor updates that he would like to include for clarification purposes, and I'll just let him go down his personal list.
I just wanted to correct a couple of things I said about the influence of the Marble Faun. Henry James began writing soon after Hawthorne stopped writing fiction, and his inspiration really began with Hawthorne's Marble Faun, because it was the beginning of what was called the international theme in James's work and in American literature, featuring the meetings of Americans and Europeans and sort of watching them interact and see what would happen to the characters, whether the American characters would be corrupted by the Old World Europeans or whether they would be safely protected by their Puritan heritage and return home without any damage to their souls. And Hawthorne's novel, of course, figured the latter scheme. You have Hilda and Kenyon, who interact with Donatello and Miriam, and they are safeguarded from the evil that besets those two Europeans when Donatello commits an act of murder by throwing the model off the Tarpeian Rock. So you have the basic scenario of the two Americans encountering this couple in Rome and then returning home without being tainted by old world corruption, namely the act of murder committed by Donatello. So this was a theme that Henry James worked quite extensively, not dealing with acts of murder, but more the encounters of Europeans whose moral world is more loosely based, so I just wanted to correct that. Another point I wanted to make was that the main inspiration for the novel, of course, was the Praxiteles faun, which Hawthorne saw in the Capitoline Museum and which is seen at the very beginning of the novel. But another important work of art is the painting of Guido Reni, his St. Michael trampling Satan, and that is a picture that is associated with the dead model who's seen in the Church of the Capuchins when he's being laid out for burial. And his image his likeness is apparently pointed out, and the painting itself provides an idea of what he might have looked like and associates him with the figure of Satan as well. We don't know who this model was. He seems to have some kind of multiple identity as a sort of Gothic villain in Miriam's life. You know, Miriam herself is a very mysterious character. She's probably has some kind of mixed ancestry, part Italian, part English, part Jewish, and the model is somehow involved in some scandal in her past, some crime that she was complicit in, and he shows up in the catacombs when the three friends, Miriam, Donatello, and Kenyon, are being tourists, and he comes out of the catacombs, sort of emerges mysteriously, and then becomes her sort of nemesis figure, and he may have been the man whom her family wanted her to marry. There's rumors that she'd rejected this suitor, and maybe his vengeance has something to do with his rejection, but he's also seemingly complicit with Miriam in some kind of crime, possibly murder, but it's all very mysterious. We don't really get this explained but at the end of the novel in the postscript very well. Another thing I wanted to point out was just for Hawthorne, it's often interesting to compare the character types because he was often writing a similar story from novel to novel. The major theme of his work, of course, is the fall, based on the Old Testament myth of Adam and Eve in the garden. So, in his first full-length novel, The Scarlet Letter, Hester and Dimmesdale are, a version of the guilty lovers, Donatello and Miriam, who have somehow complicit in some kind of sin. Just as in the Scarlet Letter, their sin that is committed before the novel begins is an adultery that results in the pregnancy of Hester. In the Scarlet Letter, we have those couples that parallel the plot, some of the plot line in the Marble Faun, but in the House of the Seven Gables, of course,
Palgrave and Phoebe are the
sort of innocent lovers like Kenyon and Hilda in the Marble Faun, and Blithedale Romance. Priscilla and Hollingsworth at the end of the book are kind of like Hilda and Kenyon again, although Hollingsworth's identity is a little more ambiguous because he is to some extent guilty of Zenobia's death. So you could say that he and Zenobia are comparable to Donatello and Miriam in an act of murder. So those are some interesting parallels with Hawthorne's other work. So I think that's kind of all I needed to say about updating information about the book.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app, and I'm back with Dr. Jonathan Cook as we discuss Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Marble Faun. All right, so let's get into it. Would you consider this one of Hawthorne's canonical works? Because on the one hand, it seems to be something that those in the know a great deal about, but I think those on the outside looking in have probably never heard of it.
Yeah, well, it was his last published novel. Came out in 1860, so there'd been a 7-year or 8-year lag between his last novel, The Blithedale Romance, and he had established his reputation with The Scarlet Letter in 1850, and then House of the Seven Gables, Blithedale Romance. They all came out within a year of each other, and then there was this big lag. Hawthorne still had his audience for the novel, but today I think it's kind of a connoisseur's book for Hawthorne. Hawthorne amateurs, and I think it takes a little bit of effort to get into it, but it's quite an intriguing book, and it's interesting in that it sort of stakes out what you call the American theme, which was picked up by Henry James. The relationship of Americans and Europeans living abroad, and the American innocent versus the European corrupt character. So it sort of pointed the novel in that direction for Henry James to pick it up immediately because, Hawthorne was his big example. So I think I don't know how to categorize it. Out of the 4 books, it's probably the least read, but it's still, I think, in some ways a masterpiece. And it just takes a little bit of work to get into, because you have to really know something about Roman history and the layout of Rome at the time in the 1850s, and you know something about art and the history of art. So it's not something of a connoisseur's book. And then there's the question of the plot, which for some people is disappointing, but I think if you kind of peel back some of the layers, it gets more interesting.
Well, that was going to be one of the things I was going to ask you, is that maybe in order to get everybody on the same page, if they've never read the Marble Faun before, if we could do a quick summation of the plot. Would you feel comfortable doing that?
Yeah.
I think I know, but I think that was one of the things that I enjoyed this text. I enjoyed going all the way through it, but I don't feel like I knew what was going on the entire time when I was making it through.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not a very complicated plot, but the storyline is kind of roundabout. It's about sort of 4 or 5 characters living in Rome in the later 1850s. Miriam is a kind of mysterious young woman who seems to have some kind of shadow over her past, and we don't really know where she comes from. There are hints that she may have some English blood. I mean, we find out a lot more about her towards the end of the book, but she's sort of a mysterious foreign woman who seems to be maybe possibly Jewish as well as English, or maybe German, but she's sort of the dark lady of the in terms of Gothic typology. And then there's this the Marble Faun himself, who is this innocent young character who gets attached to Miriam Donatello, who is an aristocrat from Tuscany. So he's not Roman. He's down in Rome from his ancestral estates in Tuscany. So Donatello, he is a sort of light-hearted young man who is thought to maybe even have ears that resemble a faun, because
right.
It's sort of the conceit that he's some kind of, intrusive mythological character into the present. So he's attached.
We might want to say something about fauns in general, because I'm not sure that's an archetype that people in 2018 are super familiar with.
Well, faun is it's a blended creature of animal and human, and it's a sort of a harmless woodland creature that you would find who had sort of a goat's identity in terms of his ears, and so a human with animal traits, or a creature that's sort of in between species of human and animal, but a harmless creature, and a follower of Pan, the god of nature.
It's kind of a chimera. I think the thing that I don't, not to get hung up on too many details, but would it be wrong to think of a faun as almost interchangeable with a satyr?
Yeah, satyrs, and I was just about to say that, yeah. Satyrs and fauns. Well, satyrs are half goat, half human, and they're followers of Dionysus. But satyrs, in the Greek sense, are lascivious and drunken. They're not temperate. So the faun, in this sense, is more a sort of a woodland deity, nature creature, not a follower of Dionysus who chases after nymphs.
I find it so interesting.
Although
I wonder, you mentioned the connection between faun and Pan. I wonder if there's a connection between Pan and pantheism and all these other pan religious movements. I thought that was kind of an interesting connection. I'm not sure it is, but
Pan,
something made me think that there might be.
Yeah, well, Pan, is the god of all of nature. So pantheism is deification of nature, which was what the god Pan was.
I suspected there was a connection there.
But anyway,
I'll
let me just finish with
it.
So Kenyon is an American artist living in Rome. He's a sculptor. Hilda is his lady friend. I mean, they're just sort of friends at this point. She's a female artist and a copyist of old masters. So the four characters are hanging out with other artists in Rome, and but the problem is that Miriam keeps being harassed and overshadowed by this mysterious character who goes under different names, but a lot of people could just call him the model, because he shows up first kind of as a stalker of Miriam, and turns out he's somebody that she had some kind of relationship with. We don't know what the relationship might have been. There are hints of different kinds, but it appears that somehow he's haunting Miriam, reminding her of some kind of evil deed that he was involved in that somehow casts a shadow on her. I mean, as though the guilt spilled over, although it's clear that she's not directly involved of any kind of crime, but she's sort of an accomplice in some sense, but we don't know what it is. So anyway, she's constantly haunted by this guy who has a sort of unappealing demeanor. He doesn't really say much in the book, but he appears at odd moments to sort of cast doubt on her, to sort of ruin her day wherever she is. So eventually, when all these people are out partying, they go by what's called the Tarpeian Rock in ancient Rome, which is near the Capitoline Hill, and Miriam makes it clear to Donatello that she wants to get rid of this guy who's stalking her, and Donatello says, "Hey, I get your drift," and throws him off the Tarpeian Rock to his death below, which is what was done to Roman traitors. So then it turns out that Hilda was just opening a door to the area where where this was happening, and Kenyon wasn't on the scene, but Hilda saw it and turned around and just couldn't believe what she saw. She was like shocked that these two people she knew so well had committed a serious crime. And so she goes back to her little artist's studio, and so what happens is Hilda turns on Miriam and says, "I can't be your friend anymore because I know you're complicit in a terrible crime." And Kenyon, in the meantime, is not privy to this information, but he goes to visit Donatello. Donatello is, transformed by this criminal act from being a happy-go-lucky sort of faun type to a morose and guilty young man. So the murder sort of humanizes him. And we find out more about this when Donatello visits him at his ancestral estate in Tuscany. So Donatello hangs out with Kenyon, and they talk a lot. But Kenyon, he's not telling Kenyon exactly what happened. But there's a transformation in his behavior, and at this point, Kenyon wants Miriam and Donatello to get back together because they were friends, and now there's some kind of shadow between them. So he tries to promote this reunion, which takes place later on in Perugia, and eventually everyone ends up back in Rome. But meanwhile, Hilda has been just burdened with this terrible knowledge that her friend was complicit in a murder, and at one point she's walking around St. Peter's, and she goes up to a confessional and spills the beans to a priest there who wants her to convert to Catholicism, although she's saying, well, I'm only using your confessional because I have something on my mind. It's not like I want to be a Catholic. And the priest, though, says, well, you realize that what you're telling me is potentially something I'd have to tell the authorities. The sort of priests confession privilege would be obsolete. So Hilda is very conscious about not wanting to get her friend arrested, but she can't help feeling like she's got to tell someone about what happened. So she does that. And eventually, she goes home and realizes that Miriam asked her to deliver a package to someone at one of these palazzos. And when Hilda does that, she disappears, and it's obvious she's somehow been arrested for what she has told about the crime, or we don't know. We're not sure. It seems as though maybe they're trying to keep her to make her turn into a Catholic or whatever. So eventually, what happens is Hilda's kept in captivity, and then Miriam somehow arranges her release at the same time that she turns in Donatello to the authorities. So the book sort of reaches this conclusion at the Roman Carnival, where Kenyon is being told by Miriam where to find Hilda, at the same time that the authorities are going to arrest Miriam and Donatello for murder, or we assume for murder. So it happens simultaneously. Hilda's released. Kenyon is, at this point, he realizes he's in love with her and wants to propose to her. So they end up going to the Pantheon in Rome, and they have this final conversation about what's happened to them, and the idea that somehow the figure of Donatello needed to commit some crime, or something horrible had to happen to him. He had to discover the existence of evil to become mature as an individual, because he's now a normal human being who's thoughtful, and he is cognizant of his guilt, and presumably he's, last we hear he's in prison. I'm not sure if he's going to be executed or whether he'll just languish in prison. But Miriam is released, and she shows up at the Pantheon in sort of penitential dress, and Miriam is, presumably recognized by Hilda and Kenyon. They say, isn't that Miriam? And then they say, well, maybe not. Kind of looks like her, whatever. But it's obvious that, Miriam is kind of blessing their union and sort of being the sacrificial lamb to their happiness for having gotten Hilda back to Kenyon. And in the meantime, Miriam presumably is going to be a sort of lost soul who's, supposedly the man who's supposed to be her husband, Donatello, is going to be in prison and maybe executed. So the two Americans are going to go back to the U.S., because they've had enough of Rome. And that's the end of the book.
I think that's a pretty fantastic summation. So, the burning question is, how would you classify this book? What genre? What genres? Is it genreless?
Well, of course, Hawthorne is writing what he calls romance, which is not a novel like Thackeray or Trollope or Dickens. He's writing books that have sort of stretched the truth a little bit, or have sort of imaginative elements to them that sort of challenge canons of verisimilitude. And but first of all, he's, as most of his books are, he's writing what you call a moral fable, which is, in this case, it's another history of the fall of man, because Donatello is obviously sort of an Adam figure as well as a faun. And Miriam is sort of the Eve who tempts him and makes him fall, and then has to face this sort of permanent exile from happiness. So another genre would be the pastoral romance, because Donatello is a sort of figure of Greek pastoral as a faun character, and so the book varies between the sort of gritty streets of Rome and the beautiful gardens that you find in Rome. The Pincino and the Villa Borghese and its grounds, and then the beautiful landscape of Tuscany that we see when Kenyon is visiting Donatello. So another genre would be Gothic romance, which is what Hawthorne kind of grew up on. Novelists like Anne Radcliffe.
Right.
And so this is a novel set in Italy with Catholicism, which was, the classic ingredients of English Gothic were, the hideous superstitions and dungeons of Catholic Europe, and particularly in Italy, nefarious aristocrats who were out to do terrible things to young women and hold them prisoner. This mysterious character of the model is sort of a Gothic villain who seems to belong to an order of Capuchin monks in a sort of penitential capacity, and he's when they take his body and get it ready for the funeral, he's laid out in this Capuchin church where Miriam sees him. Actually, Miriam and Hilda and Kenyon. So the last genre, would be sort of a novel of tourism and historical. Guidebook romance where you learn about Italy, because there's a significant amount of description of different galleries and famous sites of Rome, like the Trevi Fountain, and a lot of the sculpture in Rome in the 19th century. So I would say four major genres are included, which is not unusual for Hawthorne to sort of blend them together.
That's what an ambitious task he set for himself, or emerged in the process of writing. I have to ask, did he go to Rome with the intention of writing this book, or was he in Rome, or was he in Florence?
Well, he was in both. He got to Rome in early 1858, and he left permanently in May 1859. So in the spring, in about May 1858 or June, he went up to Florence because you had to get out of Rome because of the Roman fever, malaria, because that's when the mosquitoes would be. I mean, they didn't know malaria was transmitted with mosquitoes, but in the summer months, malaria was very much present in the streets of Rome. So Florence is where they went. They were there for about 4 months. They had 2 different locations. They got to be friends with Robert Browning and his wife and a bunch of artists up there.
Oh, wow.
But in the spring of 1858, in Rome, Hawthorne saw the statue of Praxiteles, the faun, and which was the model for the physical model for Donatello. And but the book that he actually started writing in Rome at first, which he stuck with for a month or so, was the Ancestral Footstep, which he would bring back to the U.S. and he tried to finish it. He never could get it out there. This bloody footstep. It was a legend that he heard when he was living in England about the footprint of a famous old house that was made by one of the martyrs of Mary, Bloody Mary, in the 16th century in England. So that's what he brought to Italy to write, but then he changed course after he saw the the Marble Faun got him thinking, and he started writing that and took it to Florence, and then came back to Rome in the fall of 1858. And then his daughter got sick with malaria in about November 1858, and she was really sick for about 4 months. He thought she was going to die. And he worked on the book as a way to, distract himself from his daughter's illness.
Was that Una
Una,
or Rose?
oh, Una, the oldest daughter. Yeah, she was like 14. Yeah. And
she died young, didn't she?
She died. Yeah, she had a very sad life. She never got married. She was may have been psychologically damaged by the malaria because she was a little bit odd. But anyway, he wrote the book, and then when he left Rome in May 1859, he took the book to England, where he lived from June. He lived for about a year, June 1859 to June 1860, and he rewrote the whole thing in England. And he also used his Italian notebooks for a lot of description, because he took huge chunks of his writing in the notebook to fill out information about galleries and landscape and things like that. So, his notebooks were really sort of a sketch pad for what went into the book. So he was simultaneously keeping his journals or notebooks and taking material from them to keep his novel going.
That's so cool. So you mentioned that one of the themes at play in the book is the Garden of Eden narrative. Are there other major themes that you think would be relevant to the listeners of this presentation? Another one, of course, is the international theme of Americans versus Europeans, and how they compare in their mores. I mean, here we have a dramatic contrast between Miriam, who has this mysterious evil that she's associated with through this model character, and Hilda and Kenyon, who are kind of innocent Americans who like Miriam, but both of them, realize that they're out of their depth with her. They don't understand her. She doesn't tell them about her past, and they are sort of the proverbial innocent Americans, because Hilda, who witnesses the murder, is just horrified by it. And when Kenyon at the end of the book suggests the idea that Miriam told him about the idea that maybe evil exists so that it will make us better people, that it will challenge us to develop our maturity, and that presumably that's what happened to Donatello. He couldn't have become a fully mature human unless he had done something terrible and then repented of it. So when Kenyon tells this to Hilda, and this is pretty much the idea of the fortunate fall in theology, when he tells this to Hilda, she is horrified and says, "Don't say that again. That's the most horrible thing, to think that good could come out of evil," because for her, things are very linear. It's either good or bad, and you can't, there's no gray area between the two. So she's sort of the moralistic daughter of the Puritans, who doesn't really grow. I mean, she changes somewhat. She becomes, I don't know. She psychologically she has grown somewhat, but she can't accept this idea of somehow evil and good being inextricably linked with each other, the way that Miriam is suggesting, and I think the way Hawthorne himself is suggesting, because that's one of his big themes, the idea that good and evil somehow have this mysterious interrelationship, and when you try to tear one away from the other, it's not going to work, or that somehow evil things turn out good. This is sort of the idea of providence, God's providence. There's somehow positive thing to even the worst aspects of life.
So that's another theme, the international theme.
Yeah, it's kind of a. It sounds like there's a bit of a theodicy at work here.
There is, yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. I haven't really read much about this in the literature on the book. There's really not that much from a religious angle. Of course, another theme would be the interrelationship between death and life. You know, how in Rome there's sort of this easy juxtaposition of carnival and revelry with the presence of death, and this historic culture which is everywhere shows you signs of mortality, and these catacombs where they decorate the walls with the bones of the dead monks. You know, so it's this idea that somehow life and death are mysteriously blended with each other, and we just have to accept that fact. You know, we can't.
Those chapels with the skulls.
Yeah.
Freak me out.
Have you been to Rome and seen them?
No, but I've seen.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just hard for me to understand how something like that gets associated with Christianity. You know.
Well, it's sort of a monastic sense of you know, transience of life. That if you need to be reminded of that. But I remember going to one of these places and just being you know, these huge bone piles. I mean, it's just I mean, it's appalling, but it's just part of their tradition, and it's odd to see the priests in their robes or the monks, you know, wearing their robes and spending the day collecting you know, a few lira to be able to see these bones of their predecessors and waiting for them to make a part of the heap. It's very odd.
Yeah, Well, yeah, I'll let you continue with the enumeration of the themes that you thought were relevant.
Yeah, well, I was just going to end with that one.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, in the sort of the summation of the text, we talked a little bit about, or you talked about, since you did such an excellent job with that, the interrelationship between Miriam and the model and Kenyon and Hilda. Would you like to improve upon that even more, or do you think we sort of adequately addressed it?
Well, I mean, it's something that Hawthorne deliberately left obscure, and it kind of exasperated a lot of first readers, because they just wanted to know more. I mean, even writers like Anne Radcliffe and Horace Walpole. I mean, the Gothic writers, they leave an air of mystery, but they try to do a traditional denouement by, you know, revealing what was really going on behind the scenes. And Hawthorne was dragged kicking and screaming to do that, because he added a postscript to the second edition of the novel to sort of give some background to this. And you know, what I have read is that this model figure may have been the designated, arranged husband for Miriam. You know, because she had an arranged marriage and she refused to accept it because she thought the guy was there was something wrong with him, that he was mentally ill. You know, it would be too inbred to, you know, because he was some kind of, you know, familial relation. So it could be that the model character was this disappointed suitor who, in retaliation, sort of stalked her and, you know, preyed on her, and then committed some kind of horrible crime of which she somehow is, you know, complicit. And this could be a political murder. I mean, there have been speculation that this may have been some kind of murder, say, of Pope Pius the Fourth's prime minister, which happened in 1848. There was Count Pellegrino was killed. during the Roman uprising, because things were in Italy and Rome at this point were pretty politically volatile because, the Roman Republic, there was an uprising in 1848-49, and it was put down by the French, and so Rome was under the domain of the Pope, but it was really being propped up by the French, and they had troops all over in Rome and the Papal States, and it was there was a serious movement to liberate Italy and reunify it, right? The Risorgimento, which was going on, and Garibaldi, of course, was involved in that in the 1860s. So it could be that the model was somehow involved in a political murder. So we don't know, but the more you know about the history, the more it seems that Hawthorne was sort of thinking about some of these events as possible prototypes for the crime that he had committed. That's one of the things you don't really know as a reader of the book until sort of the end, when you see the carnival and there are all these soldiers keeping an eye on the festivity so that it doesn't get out of hand and turn into some kind of uprising.
So the juxtaposition of the carnival with the you were talking about, like, the sort of the restrictive monk quarters and stuff like that, is also a very interesting thing too, is how bondage and effusion of the spirit happens in these environs as well. I've always found that interesting ever since I read Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, and how she comments on this discharging of kind of like collective energy.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's every Catholic country has a sort of festival of the Mardi Gras carnival, these characters are all caught up in the historical moment of Italy in the late 1850s, all of them brought the idea that Italy was somehow the holy land of art. So a lot of them went there to admire the beauty of the country, but at the same time, they were forced to acknowledge that politically the country was, well, there wasn't a country of Italy. The different parts of Italy were all in pretty bad shape economically. There was all kinds of beggary and poverty, and of course there was a prejudice against the Catholic religion and its domination of the culture. This whole culture of monks and priests and nuns. So that the appeal, of course, was that these Americans were just seeing this gorgeous beauty, and they were getting an aesthetic education, and that's why people like Kenyon and Hilda were there. Because there's a lot of discussion about art and the artists and painting and sculpture. And all of this was, an education for a lot of people who read the book the first time.
Definitely.
And, wanted to go to Italy to see it for themselves.
No, I meant to, just for clarification, I have gone to Italy. I just hadn't gone to that particular monastic situation that we were referencing earlier. And
the catacombs.
The catacombs. And so I've been to the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel, and stuff like that. I mean, it's totally breathtaking.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Kenyon and Hilda, but I was going to ask you, we kind of talked about things that were going on in the late 1840s, and you mentioned some things that were happening in the 1860s and how that affected the storyline. But were there particular events that were happening in 58 and 59 that you need to be
Well,
alerted to,
yeah.
or do you feel like
One of the things that I've been reading lately is that there was a Grand Duke of Tuscany, so Tuscany became a republic in the late spring of 1859. And before that, when Hawthorne was there, it was under the sway of this Grand Duke. An interesting theory is that, we know that Donatello is the last descendant of his family, this proud old Italian family in Tuscany, and he's the owner of their estate, which produces this famous wine called Sunshine. And so he's a substantial, landowner and Count of Montebeni, and it could be that
your accent is perfection, by the way. I love it.
It could be that they, rather than wanting to arrest him for the murder of this monk, because Hawthorne specifically says that the Roman authorities were more interested in the threat of political uprising than in typical crimes of murder, theft, or whatever. So it could be that he was really being arrested because the state wanted to seize his property as the last descendant of a substantial holding in Tuscany. That this Grand Duke thought it would be a good idea to get him arrested, and then so that he would lose his inheritance. So that's one possibility for some of the invisible machinations of the authorities that you really don't know, that we have to infer what they're thinking about, and what the severity of the crime would be for the authorities. Because it seems like they're pretty slow to react to arrest Donatello. I mean, he, basically a year goes by before he's finally arrested, because the novel begins in April 1858 and ends pretty much in March 1859. You can chart it by the references to the date and the season and all that. So that's one theory about what the authorities were really wanted Donatello to, face punishment.
So something you referenced in passing, and I think it would be very wise for us to spend a little bit more time talking about it, is to maybe elaborate on the particular references and episodes of art and artists that are in the novel.
Yeah. Well, Hawthorne's wife, Sophia, was an artist, and he, admired her work. She wasn't really an original artist. I mean, she had lessons when she was living in Salem with Washington Allston. I mean, she had some positive models, but she was better as a copyist really than as anything else. And so he makes Hilda into a copyist of Old Masters, so he's kind of borrowing that from his wife. So some of the artworks that are highlighted in the book are, these famous paintings and sculptures. I mean, the Faun of Praxiteles, the Dying Gladiator is the first sculpture that is mentioned that's in the Capitoline Museum. It's sort of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to the model when he's thrown from the Tarpeian rock near to the museum there. And then there's the portrait of Beatrice Cenci that Hilda has been allowed to copy. It's owned by a private owner. I think it's the Palazzo Barberini. I may be wrong with that, but anyway, Hilda is able to copy it. Miriam is not allowed to copy it, but Hilda is, and Beatrice Cenci was a famous young woman who was repeatedly raped by her father, and then she collaborated with her brother to kill the father, and then she was sentenced to death for murder, right? Even though she was, killing this monster. So this famous picture by Guido, they thought it was by Guido. We're at this point, we're not really sure who the picture is of or who it's by. It's probably not Beatrice Cenci, but Hawthorne, everyone at the time thought it was Beatrice Cenci. And it was the look on her face that was captured by Hilda, that this idea of innocence and guilt sort of combined together. Murdering the father even because he's such a monster. So this idea of good and evil being meshed together is perfectly represented by the face of Beatrice Cenci. Of course, Miriam is has got these pictures of famous female killers. Like Judith, killer of Holofernes, what's her name, Salome, who had John the Baptist's head, and Jael, Jael, who put a tent peg through the head of this guy Sisera. This is all in the Old Testament. So Miriam's preference for paintings is of female, righteous females who are killing oppressors, or, in the case of John the Baptist, female catalyst to evil. So all of her pictures are sort of reinforcing the theme of women as complicit in murder or directly involved in murders of men, just like she inspires Donatello to kill the model to get rid of him because he's stalking her. And then you have a very, a fun chapter about visiting the Trevi Fountain, which is, some of it is borrowed from a famous book about Italy called Corinne by Madame de Staël. It came out in the early 19th century, and a lot of people had read it throughout the 19th century because it was about a woman artist who's a poet living in Italy, and it's got some famous scenic descriptions of Italy that tie into the various incidents of the novel. But one of the scenes of the Trevi Fountain sort of pays homage to Madame de Staël, although a lot of the rest of the Corinne describes other parts of Italy, not Rome per se. A lot of the best known paintings and sculpture was described in the book. There's also the famous picture of Saint Michael and the dragon of I guess it's Guido as well. It was sort of the prototype for Miriam's killing of the model, right? This righteous killing of a monster, which in the picture is a human monster. I mean, it's a human form of Satan, really. Even though, in the New Testament, killing the figure of Saint Michael is killing the dragon. He's a dragon figure. So there's a sort of confluence between Satan and evil and dragon there. And so that's an influential painting that's referred to several times near the early part of the book. But when you read the book, you get kind of a mini art education about some of the leading works that you would see in Rome. And of course, you go to St. Peter's, you go to other churches, you hear about what they look and feel like. Because Hawthorne was, I mean, he wasn't a brilliant art critic, but he was a very good, intelligent observer of what he saw when he was there. A little puritanical sometimes when it came to nudity, but otherwise he sort of educated himself when he got to Rome and read up on art history with the local, the guidebooks to the local areas, and he actually went around Rome with a well-known English art historian, Anna Jameson, who gave him some lectures about what he was seeing. So,
yeah, I'm looking at images of this.
Of the
St. Michael the Dragon.
And St. Michael,
yeah, it's so good.
Of Guido, right?
There's several, obviously. Let me make sure that I think I have.
Well, he's a very romantic-looking young man with a breastplate, and the figure that he's killed is lying underneath his feet there, sort of partially bald, and he looks kind of scruffy. He doesn't really look like the devil. He looks like a kind of Italian fellow who's lost his balance.
Yeah, I think he does have wings though. If I'm looking at the right one, it's there's if you look closely, there are wings.
Yeah,
and it looks like he might be chimerical. He might be a shapeshifter.
Yeah, well, there are going to be lots of pictures of St. Michael and the Dragon, but this was where the figure is of a human.
Yeah.
Anyway,
well, Raphael painted it as well.
Yeah.
So back to particulars. So we have this sort of mysterious disappearance and reappearance of Hilda that occurs, right?
Say that again?
We have this sort of mysterious disappearance and reappearance of Hilda.
Yeah,
right. How do we account for that?
Well, it appears that she has been taken prisoner by the Roman authorities, who are kind of using her as a bargaining chip to get Miriam and Donatello arrested. I mean, at first you think, well, she's been abducted because they want to make her a Catholic, because that was a notorious issue of the time. There was a famous case of a Jewish child, who was taken out of his, away from his parents, and brought and educated in Rome and made into a priest, and this caused a sort of an international outcry. So initially you think maybe Hilda has been kidnapped by the Roman authorities to try to get her to convert somehow, to put pressure on her because she's complicit in a crime that, somehow that she can be made to convert. Well, it turns out that that wasn't such an issue as the fact that she's just being held as sort of ransom to make sure Miriam and Donatello turn themselves in. And she's being held at this convent, which is right next to the Capuchin church where the model was a member. He's called Brother Antonio. That was his monk's name. And by the way, Miriam Schaefer is the name that she goes by, but it's indicated in the book that was not her real name, so we don't even know what her name was. Miriam, of course, hints at a Jewish strain in her background. But Hilda, it's odd because she just is there as a sort of prize for Kenyon at the end of the book, released through Miriam's arrangements, and she doesn't really have much to say about her imprisonment or whatever it was in the convent. She just kind of goes with the flow and just wants to get out of Rome. When she meets up with Kenyon after that, they go back to the American and are married. We don't know where they're from, New England presumably. But the two of them, obviously, there's a little bit of Hawthorne and Sophia in Kenyon and Hilda, mixed in with some other elements.
Sophia seems like a really interesting woman. I need to do some more research on her. Sounds like she was a very loving wife. Very interesting
Sophia.
woman.
Yeah, I mean, she was the perfect wife for him. She kind of revered Hawthorne. She thought he was a genius. I mean, people thought that the marriage was a little bit claustrophobic, that she, was too reverential towards her husband. But she certainly put up with him. Well, I guess they put up with each other. She had terrible health issues. She had terrible headaches, because she grew up with migraine headaches and took a lot of this remedy at the time. She did some homeopathic remedies, but she also took this stuff that had mercury in it, right? So it may have damaged her health. I mean, she didn't live to much of an old age herself, because her health had been damaged a little bit. And when they were in England, she went to Portugal for a while to get away from the English climate in the winter. But otherwise, they were, very well suited for each other in terms of temperament and education. Because Sophia was very, smart and well read.
It'd be interesting to know more about that dynamic. I mean, you're talking about, what a woman, right? To be so compatible with this genius author. So trying to recall what the next thing I was going to ask. So the opacity of the ending of the text, this might be one of the factors that makes the book difficult for so many people. I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
Why is it so opaque?
We mentioned the fact that he had to write a postscript to the second edition, and I think a lot of people, are glad he did, because at least it gives a few clues. I mean, there's the idea that there's some kind of secret information that's imparted to the author. He presents himself as the author that he's given when they're at the top of St. Peter's, away from any kind of authority figure that might listen to them. But the whole political theme of the book is not really evident unless you do a little digging on your own. It's in a way it's not that different from the end of the Blithedale Romance, because the the figure of Westerveld, the magician, mesmerist figure, we really don't know much of that. We don't know what his relationship is. I mean, he seems like he's the husband of the heroine there, So it's not unusual for Hawthorne to sort of leave a few loose ends at the end of his books. Right. It's hard to tell if this was a function of the romance form that he was working in, or whether it was a failure of his imagination to tie things up. But the reception of the book was kind of mixed, because some people said, well, this ending is terrible, you didn't explain anything, and then other people said it was perfect. It was better to leave things sort of for the reader to be sort of guessing about what happened at the end. That aesthetically it was satisfactory. So I guess.
What do you think? Do you think that he earns that charity of allowing it to be that opaque? I mean, given what he'd done in his earlier works.
I think personally I would have liked a little more clarity on exactly what Miriam's criminal involvement was, and what the model's crime was, and whether Donatello was going to be executed or what was going to happen to him. So thematically, I think Hawthorne made his point. He was not writing a realistic novel. He was not, he's not a Dickens or a Trollope. So it's really a function of genre that he could sort of, think that this was enough for the reader to know at the end, and sort of leave people hanging and making up their own minds. So
right.
I'm a little ambivalent about it myself, as you probably can tell.
Well, allows for you to have some objectivity on the text, to be torn in different directions, kind of hover between the two viewpoints.
Yeah.
So in that hovering state, I mean, what's your read of the topography of his authorial development, and how this book relates to the previous four novels?
His four published novels are all, they all have a sort of thematic continuity. It's kind of odd that such a long period of time occurred between Blithedale and Marble Faun all this time, but he was always terrified about not having enough money, so he couldn't turn down this job that he got as the consul, and he was quite a good consul there. He was quite busy, and he made a fair amount of money. He did not make nearly the amount of money that he hoped, because Congress changed the salary rates for consular officials, so he didn't get rich by being the consul, but he made a pretty good amount of money. So he figured he had to stick it out. So he was there for 4 years, and had his little nest egg. And just like when he was working at the custom house, he couldn't really write anything. And then going to Italy sort of was his way of getting back to fiction.
Right.
So you can sort of make connections with all the books in terms of the influence of the Gothic structures and characters, and relationships of I'm thinking of Hilda and Kenyon in relation to Phoebe and her match in House of the Seven Gables. You can plot all kinds of connections between the books.
Definitely.
So,
well, you mentioned that people were dissatisfied with the opacity of the ending, but were there any other? Were there? how was it received besides that? You know, I mean, what was the initial reception like?
People, loved that Hawthorne was back with another novel, and they loved reading about Italy. A lot of them wanted to go there and see things for themselves. But some critics were not that impressed with it. They thought there was too much guidebook material. They thought it was like a short story that had been padded out with a lot of prose about Italy. But I mean, in terms of academic criticism, there's quite a lot today. I mean, dozens of articles, just like any major author. But there's still, I think, a lot that needs to be investigated about it, and I mean, it's a book that has some beautiful writing, like Hawthorne is always able to do. Some of these beautiful passages of description and moral analysis, kind of like George Eliot, with his really very beautiful, eloquent moral observations about the characters and whatnot. So stylistically, it's classic Hawthorne, I think certainly a book that if you don't really understand it the first time around, you're probably going to get a lot more out of it the second time.
Well, hopefully what we've done here today will, guide people and allow them to get a lot out of the reading experience, whether it be the first, second, or third time reading it.
Yeah.
And I think we've been going for an hour 15 or so.
Yeah.
An hour. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
Nope. Just another book that you want to put on your list and take a look at.
Yeah, man. Well, it's always a pleasure. I'm very grateful to be able to have these conversations with you. I think I speak on behalf of many people you don't know, that we're very thankful to have you weigh in on these topics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that we get to preserve your legacy in this way. Your research and your teaching ability. So I can't thank you enough for teaching all of us today. I mean, I learned a ton. So thank you. And I guess all I would just say is if you want to find this conversation, you can find it on YouTube, SoundCloud, and the first version of the Noetic app. We're trying our hardest to push the new version. So just stay tuned. I know I've been saying that for a while now, but it'll be worth the wait. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook.
I'll see you.
All right.